What's going on, everybody, and welcome to our first interview with Dr. Lisa Babbage. Join us as we experience her story from poverty to film producer and everything in between. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Dr. Lisa Babbage.
Greetings, I'm Dr. Lisa Babbage. I'm a Georgian who is passionate about teaching our children, served as a public school educator for the last 18 years as well as an adjunct professor, and I am a conservative. Over the past 20 or so years, I've been involved in a myriad of Georgia politics as well as have run for a federal seat in Congress. I started out many years ago volunteering with the local GOP in Fulton County. And that path took me all the way to that run for Congress. I've been door knocking, phone banking, writing postcards, everything you can think of with a campaign. And I've also served our community in many ways. I've worked with students who are at risk in various nonprofit organizations. I've started my own nonprofit. And I work with 3 national organizations who are fighting for kids' rights and the future of our country. Definition of conservative values really goes back historically to our Constitution and the Bible upon which it was based. I feel like as Americans, we have within our heart this desire to push that which is pure forward. And although we fall short every single day, the main thing that I focus conservatism on is just keeping that family unit intact and pushing it to its fullest potential. And part of that is the reason why I became an educator. So many times we see that divisive ideologies, protocols, and policies really detract from the unique identity each one of us has been given by God. So as a conservative, my aim is to hold on to that with everything that I have and make sure that young people and old people understand that that is the essence of who we are as human beings. For me, it's pretty difficult to place the thankfulness for my conservative values on anyone without mentioning Jesus. As a conservative, I really tie those beliefs back to the biblical foundation on which I try to live my life. Of course, we all fall short, but Jesus is really where I got my conservative principles. I came to faith at a very young age. And, I just try to live out what I believe God called us to in the uniqueness. And conservative principles allow us to push the envelope into that uniqueness of who we are, to kind of be all we can be. I will state that my mother, it was a great influence. She says that she left the Democrat Party at age 8 when she was no longer welcome. So she always encouraged us to follow a path of conservatism and taught us what it meant to follow in the path of righteousness that God lays out for us. Outside of my circle, though, I can also give credit to folks like Frederick Douglass. When I looked back in history, I found Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass to be amongst the 2 biggest mentors, if you will, in my life and how I wanted to present conservative values to not just my children, but also my students. I will say that Condoleezza Rice is also an all-time favorite. They really showed me that the color of my skin or my gender has nothing to do with the principles I embrace. It's what my end goal is and the path to achieve it. When I was a child, Black History Month was something that was very much the focus of our entire school and our entire community. I went to a school that was predominantly Black by far. My community was 100% Black. My brother and I used to joke that if a white person showed up, they were probably one of our relatives because there just weren't any others around. So when I think about Black History Month, it's very tongue-in-cheek for me to a certain degree, because of all the stereotypes and criticisms that do come against it, for it being the shortest month of the year, for it being, 1/12 of our focus when we think about history. But I cast all that aside when I consider our current landscape. We have so many issues now that debate whether or not Black America is appreciated. Reparations comes into that conversation. And while most of my life I have been pretty much against reparations, I have really embraced the whole idea of learning about the various views regarding this topic and how it could look in our country if we chose to make more steps towards repairing the damage that occurred during slavery. The reason why I was against reparations previously is because I do believe that our country, especially conservatives in our country and abolitionists, did more than any other nation on earth to repair the damage of slavery, which was a global plight. But recently I have just had the image of a torn cloth. You know, many times we think about the fabric of America and the tearing that occurred during slavery, not just tearing of families, but of communities. When that cloth is repaired, you can still see the stitching. And those of us who are my age or even older, we remember reinforcing a tear in a child's pair of pants with additional material. That's where I think our conversation of reparations should go in our country today. You know, we see a divisiveness, we see an economic slavery that still exists throughout urban America. It hasn't been repaired. And frankly, when we think about the greatness of our history's leaders and the fact that they did free the slaves, and I'm thankful for that, what didn't happen is the wraparound services, if you will, the bumpers, if you will, the guides, if you will, that would allow those free slaves to truly live out the American dream. And so we have found many people in our country fall into a gap the size of the Grand Canyon. Many of them have become bitter because of that. And I do think we owe it to our great society, this American experiment. We owe it to our children, our grandchildren, even to ourselves, to make sure that we've done everything to bring every American up. I really want to be a part of a rising tide that lifts all boats, and I believe most conservatives believe the same way. Critical race theory, CRT, is a divisive ideology. There's no other way to paint that canvas. And as a teacher, I'm intimately disgusted with the premise that our institutions would be infiltrated, especially after all we've done as Americans to overcome division. CRT is a lazy way of dealing with diversity in the classroom, I always say. It's a lazy way of dealing with diversity in the military or in the workplace. There are social emotional problems that people have. We do need to recognize and appreciate diversity, that's true. But there is a huge difference between equity and equality. I'm sure many of you have seen the graphics that depict it. But I just encourage you to recognize that me, myself, for example, I was raised in an urban housing project, a ghetto. I stood in line for free food every summer. I had free and reduced lunch my entire 12 years of primary education. And when I left school to attempt to go to college, I found myself impoverished yet again. You know, there are so many people that have this same story, and they're fewer and far between perhaps nowadays thanks to technology, but there are still many that are struggling, and that divisiveness that's being capitalized upon by CRT and the proponents thereof will only destroy our nation. You know, there are ways to characterize students. There are ways to characterize individuals, character being the root word. That does not mean equity. It does mean equality. You know, Martin Luther King talked about that so many years ago, and it's unfathomable to me that we have forgotten his words in such a recent history. You know, we celebrate his holiday coming up, yet we forget the words that he preached. He was a preacher. All of this goes back to the Bible in my mindset. But when we look at individuals, even within our own family, many of us look just alike. Do we divide those individuals based on their physical characteristics, just a small piece of who they are? Or do we look at the true self, the soul, the mind, the will, the emotions, the things that make that person who they are? That's what teachers should focus on. They should focus on academics, of course, but in order to bring academics to the child, it must be character-based. That's a lot harder than looking at the physical characteristics of an individual and grouping them based on those physical characteristics. I always joke and say that most people change color every year. In the summer, they're one color, and in the winter, they're another. That has nothing to do with your ethnicity. It's just science. And myself, my father is white, my mother is black. Am I to oppress myself and be the victim of myself? That's what critical race theory says. There's so many flaws in that practice, And the fact that it's infiltrating K-12 education is most egregious. I believe adults can have sane conversations and discourse about movements and ideologies. But when we expose children to them, we really corrupt and change the trajectory they are on by threatening their identity. You know, most people don't know that CRT actually started with critical theory. It was an economic revolution that started with the bourgeoisie. And even in urban culture, we talk about the bourgeoisie, we call them bougie. But this group of individuals was in combat with the working class. That, however, has nothing to do with what CRT is promoting now in our schools. What we are doing is shaping or changing the shape of young minds, and we're corrupting it. I've been asked many times what I would say to Black America in a neighborhood that like the one I grew up in. I grew up in Grady Homes, which is in Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta, and I go back there all the time. I go back to feed the homeless, I go back to shake a hand, I go back to see the school where I used to walk home from and visit the sites. The community is different, but it's the same. So how do I broach that conversation with people? How do I inform them what conservatism is? How do I encourage them? It's a challenge, I will not lie. Every time I go down there, sometimes it's just with my hand. You know, sometimes it's just lending a hand to them and letting them know that someone cares. That's at the essence of conservatism. Sometimes I go back and we have conversations. I love sitting on a park bench in Hurt Park and talking to the bums, because those bums are the people that are part of my childhood. As I encounter Black America face to face, I just want to encourage them. I want to say, you know, the American dream is for everyone. That's what it states in our Constitution. And that Constitution, thankfully, has not been overturned. I want to encourage them that I was once where they are. You know, it took a lot for me and my family to be able to leave that impoverished lifestyle. It took an entire generation, I'll be honest with you. And when I became homeless later on as an adult due to a bad medical diagnosis, I found myself back in that same situation. So the cycle of poverty that plagues many people, I completely relate to. It's having that relationship, that relatability to folks that you're trying to express an idea to that is key. There's no way for anyone to understand what it means to be a conservative if you don't understand them. So I just try to express the fact that while you may feel hopeless, hope is not lost. You know, we live in the greatest country in the world, I do believe that. And while it's far from perfect, I know that nothing on this earth is. But I do know that the laws that we have in place allow me to strive for it. And in that striving comes life. And in the accomplishments that the strife brings comes hope. And we've got to have hope. When you look at the mother who's struggling with her kids, and you see that, you know, perhaps she's voted the same way her entire life, the same way her parents or grandparents voted, when you see the pain, I think it's important for each one of us to understand that the pain has to be acknowledged, the regrets, the hurts have to be acknowledged, but so does the way forward. And we have to listen. You know, many times we want to share our answers before we've even heard the problem. You know, we presume quite a bit. It's important for us as we reach out to conservatives, I believe, to just establish those relationships in love, godly love preferably, without pity, but with empathy. It's something that's lost in our society. You know, race has been a big conversation in our country for the last couple of years. You know, we thought it was dead with the Ku Klux Klan, but media has brought it back. I just want to talk to the people who are like me. You know, 22 million Americans are multi-ethnic. In my family, I have just about everybody. The one thing that we've learned is not what we look like, it's really who we are that makes the difference. And I challenge all of America to look to the lens of life that way. Most of us are blended. Whether or not you're blended because you've been divorced and remarried, perhaps you've adopted and fostered, or perhaps like my family, you're a rainbow of people. That's really who America is. So I wrote a book called The Black History Bible, and it started from, in my mind, the most unlikely places. I was running for Congress in 2020, and a black pastor who heard me on the radio reached out to me, and he said, "You should be the source of information for Black America." As a teacher, of course, that spoke to my wheelhouse, but I had no idea what he was talking about. So after many conversations and much prayer, we came up with this idea of the Black History Bible, telling the truth in my mind about the Democrat Party and what it had done to Black America over the last 70 years. I'm pretty much a natural researcher. It didn't take long for me to get this book out, but the challenge that this pastor gave me was to have it out for Black History Month. He said the importance of teaching the true history, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, was important, and coming from a black voice that it would echo to the community. I took on that challenge and wrote the book in 2020 and released it for Black History Month. Since then, that book has been turned into a documentary called Systematic Deception. And the story upon how that came to be is just as far-fetched as a black pastor asking me to write a book about the Democrat Party. So I am very much the writer and unfortunately not as good a reader. So the path that the book took to becoming a film actually went through my mother, the person who inspired me to live as a conservative. She read it, and upon closing that last page, she said, "This should be a movie." I will give you a caveat. My mother is a movie buff, and she thinks most things should be a movie. But as a teacher, I began to understand that so many people don't take the time to read. And even though I wrote the Black History Bible very conversationally and very brief in order to get the point across, I recognized that moving pictures would tell the story afresh. So we sent that book to everyone we knew and people we didn't know. One of the books landed in the hands of cinematographer Frank Panico. He is a Florida part-time cinematographer, full-time pro-life activist. I sent him the book and he invited me to speak. 2 days later, when I showed up, he had finished the book and he said this would be his next project. That's how Systematic Deception came to film. So I'd love for folks to connect with me on Facebook at Lisa Noël Babbage, but I do have a website as well, lisanoelbabbage.com. And the movie, Systematic Deception, you can find out more information at systematicdeceptionmovie.com.